Here is a short overview of my MakerBeam 2-chamber vertical chassis proof of concept setup as a home lab. The chassis measures 350 millimeters tall with 10 millimeter feet attached. It measures 220 by 220 millimeters square in depth and width. Both sections are each 170 millimeters in height. The upper section can fit 2-slot graphics cards up to 210 millimeters in length. The vertically mounted SFX power supply has its own side pressure intake with rear exhaust. A variety of airflow arrangements are possible. Downdraft and front to back can both be used. The horizontal motherboard arrangement allows clearance for a NVMe to SATA adapter to be mounted in the bottom motherboard NVMe slot, providing an additional 5 SATA connections in addition to the 4 provided on the Aorus B550 ITX motherboard. One FlexiDock from IcyDock with 4 hot swappable SATA 2.5-inch drives designed to be installed in a 5 1/4-inch slot was installed for silent desktop operation. Obviously, standard 3.5-inch mechanical hard drives could be installed in addition to or instead of the FlexiDock, or a second FlexiDock installed along with one 3.5-inch drive. Here's the GPU side of the chassis. Here is the rear I/O side of the chassis. And here's the power supply side of the chassis. A second lower height base section was also constructed for when additional storage is not required. This lower height section is 130 millimeters in height with 10 millimeter feet. The chassis height, however, remains the same at 350 millimeters. With the upper section being square, the motherboard is now placed vertically in one of 3 orientations depending on user preference and the ability when the rear I/O panel is faced upwards for substantially longer 2-slot graphics cards to be fitted, extending through the lower section of the chassis. The SFX power supply is now placed horizontally with either rear or side exhaust to align with the graphics card video cable. Here is the chassis with the graphics card facing downwards and side-mounted power supply. Here's the I/O side of the case and rear and power supply. Here's the rear of the motherboard side. And here's the opposite side of the case. Here is the chassis with top-facing I/O and graphics card facing downwards and capable of extending through the lower chamber and the rear-mounted power supply. Here's the graphics card side of the chassis. Here's the rear of the chassis. Here's the other side of the chassis. And here's the top I/O portion of the chassis. Here is the chassis with a top-mounted graphics card and rear-mounted power supply. Here's this side of the chassis. Here's the rear of the chassis. Here's the I/O side of the chassis. And here's the top mounted graphics card.